Hello everyone. Welcome to my talk on enterprise apps using Ionic Monorepos and DevOps. First of all, thank you for having me here. Really appreciate it. Before we start, a quick introduction about myself. My name is Ranjoy Sen. I'm a principal mobile architect at Collins Aerospace. I live in Bangalore, India. Before we start, let's take a quick look at the agenda for our today. Why we so we start with why we need a repository architecture, what are the typical problems we basically face while designing an application, what are the rescue approaches and how Monorepo comes into rescue, what are the DevOps principles we follow in context to a monorepository. We'll take a look at one of the Monorepo's demos as well, and then we'll try to sum it up with some of the positives and negatives about Monorepo versus multi-repo approach. Okay, so why we need a repository architecture? In an enterprise sector, you basically do not start an application which is very large in nature. You basically start small and then you add your frameworks, best practices, and eventually your application is good to go for your market. Then what you get is similar application. You tend to copy multiple things into different applications so that because you want to follow the best practices you would have followed from your first application itself. But when you think about scaling the application development, there are some classic problems we always face. Some of them are, growing your application in complexity, increasing number of requirements you always get. You got to think about how your memory footprint is always small so that your application is fast. You always have more and more number of developers joining your team, and of course you also would like to make sure that your team members get rotated so that they don't get bored and your knowledge keeps flowing. So when you think about scaling up an application, you got to invest in repository architecture. The reason behind that is when your application is small, rather one, you should be able to achieve your features. Your go-to market will become far easier. But as your requirements keeps increasing, you would see that your go-to market takes time, right? So what we really need to get into a mode is in the blue line, where even though our requirements are increasing, they are complex in nature, they are applicable to multiple applications at the same point of time, our go to market time is still less. That's where you would think about investing your time in how you can build up a right kind of a repository so that this helps you in achieving your goals. Okay, so let's take a look at how do we, what are the typical challenges we get while designing an application. So in a typical JavaScript based application, what we see is we have an application module, we have quite a few feature modules, and we get share modules. And of course, we do have our best practices, which is implemented in this particular application. What we see is when we get multiple application of similar sort, we tend to copy our structure, and at the same point we are copying a lot more code into multiple application, which eventually needs to maintain at different repository levels. With this approach, what we get is each application works in silos. That's one of the problem. Your code style will go for a toss because you may maintain them, you may not maintain. That's goes out of your control. The architecture patterns which you probably thought is best for your applications may just change because now different application can follow different architectural patterns. Whether you want to test your application all the while or you may just skip, that's also goes away from your control because the teams are different. And of course your functionalities are being copied at multiple layers. Eventually what will happen is that your dependency will become a hell because now you are pointing to different dependency binary versions which may not get updated at the same time. So the whole in this whole approach you see a lot of challenges. In terms of rescue, there are two approaches which we can always look for. The first one is npm packages and the second one is monorepo approach. So let's take a look at each one of them in little detail. In the npm package way, what we see that you structure your code in such a way that your npm package follows your pattern. You create your library, you test them, blend them, build your package, and then eventually deploy them into repository, right? npm repository, and eventually you use the same package into your own application. In this particular approach, there is a problem which is called a diamond dependency problem. Let's see how does that work. let's say that I have, couple of application which is eventually utilizing same different versions of the same library. In this particular example, you can see that application B, which is pointing to the first version of the library 1. However, application C, which is pointing to library 2 and 3, which is under the hood pointing to the fifth version of the library 1. So now when you want to make sure that your all application follows the same binary, you would eventually get into a dependency hell, because right now you would need to make sure that your library 2 and library 3 also gets updated while you want to use the same version as of application B what is using. So eventually it goes beyond your control, right? Because you don't expect every library to be updated at the same point of time, right? So because you would obviously get different types of conflicts, because your compiler would obviously take one version of the library and not the multiple one, right? And at the same point of time, you can't even enforce different teams to follow exact same pattern, because you want to have the latest version of the library. So in this way, as we see, the problem really occurs. One of the rescue approaches, or one of the way we can really solve this problem is by having something called a monorepository. In a monorepository, the basic concept is you keep all your projects, libraries, best practices in the exact same repository. It basically becomes a giant repository, which you need to manage, right? There is no multiple repositories here. The second, best practices, you got to follow the trunk-based development approach. Then you commit while your code is committed. It will be available to everyone at the same point of time, because you are now pointing towards the source code rather than the library binary itself, right? So there is no way you would get a deprecated version of the code. You always work with the updated version of the code. At the same point of time, whatever dependencies is applicable across the application, that gets managed from the central configuration side, so that you get to see you don't get to see a conflict in terms of different application uses different versions of the same library, right? That problem is almost not there. At the same point of time, there is a humongous amount of sharing of code which you can actually do in different application layer, because right now you would start creating a lot more libraries than you usually do, because that particular code can be easily shared across multiple applications, and a lot less code, which means a lot less bugs. That's where we may want to approach, right? At the same time, you would also have your build systems, your test systems, your code smell systems, all are configured in the central repository, which really means that you don't have to bother about, once you're done for one, it will be applicable to everybody else, so that headache is no more there. In general, this is how your monorepository gets structured. You basically have apps folder keeping all the applications. You have shared library for keeping anything and everything which is common across multiple applications. You have your build and deployment configurations, your code analyzers, your test suite. Everything is common across multiple apps, virtual and shared repository as well. And then from the rule standpoint, you have your design principles applicable across. You should be able to maintain your implementation guidelines, your contribution guidelines. So that eventually says that you have one source of truth which is applicable across all applications. So that really means that when you bring a new developer to your team, he or she would have a very, very less time in context to understanding what principles every single application follows, so that he should be able to be productive probably much earlier than understanding multiple repositories. And of course, from your deployment standpoint, you can have templates designed which can be shared across multiple apps, so that becomes easy too. Well, that monorepository doesn't come out of the box. It basically comes along with a tool set which you got to design on your own. It starts with the project workspace management, which really means that how you are keeping your folders and files into such a way that they can share path dependent on each other. That becomes easy for them. How you're keeping your package orchestration right, which means that how you're keeping your dependency structures right. You're not copying and pasting same dependencies to multiple applications. So you got to make your dependency orchestration in the right way. How you're keeping your code analyzers and linters, configuring them so that every single rule what you keep there is applicable across your apps and libraries, because that's going to be really really helpful for you. And then what is the test tool you use for your application, because that's going to be useful at the end of the day. Whatever rules you set is probably going to be applicable across all applications, so that no application goes behind. It won't be dependent on the teams to say that, hey, I don't want to follow the unit test approach, which is, let's say, comes under 70% coverage, where the other team is following, let's say, about 90 or 95% coverage. So that's in your control. Now you can say that, yes, until and unless my application goes beyond 90%, it's not a candidate for even for the deployment. Yeah. So you would also like to keep your build systems in mind, and should be able to create scripts for them so that it's easy for you to run your applications, lint your applications from one command line, right? That's becomes easy. And then at the end of the day, your CI/CD infrastructure needs to be created in such a way that they pull up code from specific folders of the application, and they get kicked in only if the code or the commit is applicable to one application versus multiple applications. So that intelligence needs to be built into your CI/CD infrastructure. So that's about the custom toolchain. Once we have everything up and running, it's probably a little bit of work in the first phase. Was once it's up and running, it would make your life far simpler and easier in terms of adding multiple applications to your pipeline. Okay, in context to your Angular or Ionic specific monorepositories, there are five typical files which we work with to do this entire orchestration up and running. The first one is ioniconfig.json, which has got access towards your all applications. Your package JSON has got the dependency management. Your Angular JSON has got details about your application paths in context to all the artifacts along with your libraries. Your TS config has got details about your TypeScript configurations and library path. Your TS lint, ES lint perhaps has got details about your linting and linting or analyzers, right? And then eventually you might want to add your Karma configurations for your testing suite. Okay, once you have these things up and running, you might want to concentrate on the DevOps approaches for monorepositories, because there most of the logical legal boundaries lie, right? And the first and foremost approach is force all developers to concentrate on the head version of the trunk rather than concentrating on different releases of the trunk, right? That's one of the most important aspect of monorepositories. If you want to create releases, they basically get released from the specific revisions of the repositories, right? And not the revisions of the revision, right? That's not the approach what we follow. Any kind of changes which you commit is basically as an atomic commit, which really means that it's applicable across all the application as well as the libraries, which really means that now the moment, let's say that I am a library developer, the moment I commit to a library, my team will have access to any changes which I have made right away, and then they should still be able to start working towards that. And then have a agreement across your teams that which version of the binaries, if you want to work with, what are those binaries you want to have into your repository, because now your binaries or your packages are managed centralized. So you might want to have some sort of a lockdown approach. They say that, hey, this is the version I'm going to work with, and you please go ahead and update in at any updates you need to make for your applications so that it doesn't break. In a simplified way of monorepositories, version management, let's say that you have your prod or master, which is pointing towards the production environment. You might want to start with, let's say, dev, Q, and UAT. The most updated code should be there on the dev, and that's where the entire team should be focusing on in context to committing your pieces of code. From dev, if you want to move to QA, what you need to do is creating a pull request and not committing the code straight away in QA, and then getting your code up and running into your QA. The same is applicable for UAT, so right? So QA to UAT and UAT to master. Right, that's the flow which you're going to make or follow when you want to have a CI/CD infrastructure for your monorepositories. So let's say that you are committing the code for application 3, right? It shouldn't happen in a way that this particular commit kicks in every single application deployment, right? Because that's going to be a disaster. Because right now, in a usual, repository structure, because one application is there in one repository, you do not care much because the moment you kick in one change, it should eventually start your CI/CD pipelines. But in this particular context, that should not be the way of doing. So we're going to do some configuration changes in our YAML files, which is nothing more than the pipelines as well, so that it picks up the right application for the right commit. Yeah. So let's say that I have multiple libraries and the code is committed to the libraries, which really means that if that library code is applicable across all the applications, you might want to create the design in such a way that it only kicks in those specific applications and not all one. On the other hand, when you want to have your one application changes specific to that app, only that application gets kicked in terms of your pipeline. And then it will go through the eventual structure in terms of your port smell check, your dependency installation, your artifact generation, and then eventually publish to wherever it needs to go. The similar approaches gets followed while you migrate from your dev branch to rather a QA branch or a rather a more upper head branches like UAT to master. You don't commit them, but rather you create pull request, and based on which pull request has got commits from one application versus multiple applications, your pipeline will eventually get kicked in, and then all those applications which are release candidate will eventually be released to the specific path. Okay, so let's take a look at one of the Monorepo demos of whatever the theoretical statements we have worked through. You can take a look at this GitHub repository for all the instructions about how the Monorepo has been created, what are the typical design patterns which has been used, and stuffs like that. So this is the repository where all the instructions are loaded. You might just take a look at that. That would really help. Now you see three applications out here, which is basically taking the templates of Ionic. The first one is the list app, the side menu application. The second one is the list application, and the third one is basically the tabs application. All are templates of Ionic. What you see, the hello message, which is in red, is basically a shared component which is running, which is been called from every single application which is part of the same repository architecture, right? So let's now take a look at how that repository has been maintained. So let's say that you are, let's try to look at the root level structure first. At the root level, as you can see, this is where most of the configurations is been managed. The first one probably is the package JSON, or yeah, so where all the dependencies and dev dependencies are called. This is the only place where the dependencies are managed and not anywhere else. Apart from that, we have scripts place where all the build scripts are written. Specific to the first two are web-based applications, so I do have web-based scripts. The third one is basically a mobile application, so I have mobile specific scripts. So but rather than that, you have your lint rules, and your test rules are all part of that, so that you should be able to run them from the same repository. Your Ioniconfig.json is basically responsible for holding all the applications whichever there in your repository. Your Angular.json is probably the most important space where all your application specific paths are constructed, as well as your library specific paths. So this is one place where you would really like to spend good amount of time while you're constructing your monorepository. Apart from that, your TS lint basically holds all the rules about your linting process, which is again centralized in nature. And then your apps folder has got access to all the applications in your repository. And these works in silos, right? So I do not have anything specific to packages in the library in this particular application, because all packages are basically maintained from the root level. The same is applicable towards your TS config, your ES lints. Yeah, all of them are basically configured at the central level. Um, ap- Apart from that, your SRC has got details about your application specific code. Now coming back to something which is library specific or something which is common across the application is basically the library folder, where I have one shared library which has got details about that shared piece, which I want to call from different application and get them. So while you're building the application, what it will do is it will pull off the code for application and the pull up the code for the libraries, right? And that's where it will build your entire application. It will deploy somewhere wherever it needs to go. Node modules, as you can see, is only part of my root and not part of any of the other places, because it all depends upon your package JSON. In context to deployment, you would like to take a look at the workflows folder, where let's say that I want to deploy a list to a certain path, and it's all on the main branch. So I'm just saying that if you should be able to push if it is committed on the main branch, and of course the files are belongs to the list application or the libraries, right? These are the two areas which I'm saying that, hey, only kick off this pipeline if your commits belongs to any of this, otherwise do not even bother. Here you can even go and say that I'm looking for very specific libraries and not all the libraries. Even that configuration, if you really want, you can kick in here. So that's one of the way you can create a simplistic monorepos and then work with something which is very custom designed, to get your job done. Okay. Okay, coming back to some of the goods and bads about the monorepos versus multi-repo approach. On the IDE specification, specific to IDEs, on a multi-repo you basically work with multiple IDEs, versus on a monorepo your one ID has got all the application. So you should be able to write code in your application as well as on the shared libraries at the same time. So that's a good one. You should be able to have one CLI open for all the application and can work with them. On the access specification, you still do not have a way to restrict your team members to a specific folder in context to monorepositories. However, on a multi-repository, it's very clear that every single team can have their own ownership. You should be able to make far better, refactoring in context to Monorepo, because now you are almost making no duplication of the code. However, on the multi-repositories, you are making multiple clone of the same code. So any changes to one particular, shared piece should go to every single repository. So that can be one painful approach. Since your code is accessible everyone, it's easy to discover if there is a change which needs to happen in future, versus to something which is on the multi-repo where everybody doesn't have access or see how that code has been written. So that's one way you can make things easier in context to discoverability. You would be able to manage one repo in monorepository versus multiple repos in multi-repo, right? So managing repositories are easier. Your dependency is almost not there, because now your dependencies are almost maintained from one source, versus dependencies which is there in every single repository, right? So let's say that you want to make a update to one of the repository is basically applicable across for Monorepo versus you got to let convince your other teammates saying that, hey, this particular link is needs to be updated to get a better better benefits out of that library, right? Your pull requests are easy because now you are pulling off multiple commits into one pull request versus commits into every single. So you got to have, so someone who is reviewing your code will have better visibility in terms of looking into every single commit and making sure that yes, this commit is really good for all the changes whichever is applicable across libraries and applications versus something on multi-repo which doesn't have the visibility around them. Deployment becomes a little easy in Monorepo because now you can have templates which is applicable for all versus you got to create the same repetitive pipeline creation for every single repository. So based on which you want to take, this can be goods or bads about the Monorepo versus the multi-repo approaches. Um, there are many organizations which uses Monorepo. I think Angular is one of the biggest Monorepo which we can see right away. Apart from that, there are other organizations also who uses Monorepo, and there are proven facts that Monorepo really works out in context to managing large amount of code. Um, the demo which I've shown is basically a custom built scripts. However, if you think that your repository is far complex in nature, you can still look into the tools which is available in today's world, which is like let's say Lerna, Narwhal extensions, Bazel, TurboRepo are some of the tools which is available. So based on your needs, you might want to choose based on your custom built scripts versus something which is available. So this choice is really yours. Summing it up, so Monorepo is definitely not one silver bullet applicable across any application, right? If you really have a very large amount of code which you think can be shareable, Monorepo is one of the approach. And in my personal opinion, you get the best out of Monorepo if your language configurations are similar, your frameworks are similar, your architectural approaches are similar into multiple applications, you would get a really good benefit. If it is not, then perhaps you might want to take a look at how you can utilize your multi-repo approach and take the good pieces from the Monorepo approach, right? And of course, based on your need, you might want to take a look at your complexity of needs and then choose your right tool for the right job. With that, I'll give a pause to my talk, and then if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them back. You can connect me in my Twitter, LinkedIn. I'm more active in LinkedIn out there. Take a look at the repository, contribute towards them. I'll be more than happy. Yeah, and thank you for having me here. Have a good day.